Hello and welcome back to the Rekt Capital channel, and welcome to today's video about my personal Bitcoin investing strategy for 2020. This video is going to be a breakdown of my investing strategy into 6 key parts, and I'm going to be covering each part in a little bit more detail so as to give you an idea as to what I'm watching for when it comes to Bitcoin's price action going forward. So without further ado, let's dive right into the video, and the first thing that I'm going to be concentrating on is the 200 daily exponential moving average. The 200 daily EMA is an important long-term gauge of investor sentiment, and it is this black line right over here. And this is something I'm going to be watching for because tying in with this monthly range, something that you guys are definitely familiar with by now if you've been watching my channel for a while. This is the monthly range for Bitcoin's price action, and it has been an important reference point for price. And as you can see, the midpoint to this range, the range equilibrium, is in alignment with this 200 daily EMA. So there is some confluence of demand at around this region. So this is essentially where we bounced most recently. So here's what I'm looking for. I'm going to be looking for a breakdown from the 200 daily EMA. And of course, this isn't a given. This isn't necessarily something me predicting that will happen. I'm just going to be prepared if this indeed does happen, because I know that the range equilibrium, this point right over here, doesn't figure as a very compelling support if we see a breakdown from this 200 daily EMA. This particular instance showed us that we saw a very strong sell-off, and then we saw an accumulation period, so essentially a financial opportunity. So for me, a breakdown from the 200 daily EMA is going to be a financial opportunity, one that I'm going to definitely take advantage of by accumulating some Bitcoin for my investing portfolio. And here's the second part to my investing strategy for 2020 when it comes to Bitcoin. This seems like a complicated chart, and I've actually spoken about this chart in so much more detail in a previous video, so check that video out in the top right hand corner if you'd like to learn a bit more about it. In this video, I'm just going to cover a few key levels that I'm going to be watching for. So essentially speaking, the weekly high or low, the black high or low right over here and right over here, as well as over here, we tend to see this repeating tendency prior to each of the halvings, and these halvings are essentially the vertical blue lines right over here and here as well. So we have 3 halvings and 3 higher lows on the weekly time frame, and if we look at each of these weekly higher lows, we notice that there is a respecting of this higher low and then a rebound that makes Bitcoin press past a old yearly high, and this is essentially what the purple horizontals mean. So what does this mean for my investing strategy? So if we see a rebound from the weekly high or low and then we press past the yearly high, then this is of course a tendency that we also see here prior to halving 2, of course, and this is also something that I'm going to be watching for prior to halving 3, and we're very, very close. So indeed, once we actually see a breakdown from the 200 daily EMA, history will repeat itself in the form of a test of this weekly high or low, which will be quite interesting for me in terms of my investing strategy. That's something I'm watching for, and that weekly high or low is actually quite confluent with the range low right over here. So that's $7,770. So that confluence on the weekly high or low with this monthly range is very interesting to me. That's something I'm going to be looking for on the weekly time frame, but of course on this daily time frame, if we do see a breakdown from the 200 daily EMA and we see price revisit this level, we have to be also open to the fact that we could see some wicking, some price action below this level even, as a deviation from the range. And here's an interesting thing as well, 56 days prior to halving 2 is when we saw that rebound from the weekly high or low, and we are around 50 or at least 70 days, 68 days away from the halving right now. So we are seeing some confluence in terms of price positioning relative to the higher low on the weekly chart, but we're also seeing some confluence in terms of time. Of course, I don't really pay attention to time as a factor in terms of technical analysis and price movements, but it is interesting that we are seeing confluence not only in price positioning, but also time as well. So something I'm looking for, because of course this is somewhere that I'll be accumulating once we get those levels, and bearing in mind that we might see some wicking price action as well, just accounting for that outlier activity, for those extreme panic selling emotions. We have to bear in mind that we might see that volatility at those levels once we get them. So let's move on to the third part that I'm looking for in terms of Bitcoin and my investing strategy. In this part, I'm going to be focusing on the purple resistance, because of course, in each case, the old yearly high prior to the halving figured as a resistance. And this is something I talk about in an earlier video in more detail, so I won't go into too much depth right over here, but essentially speaking, for this particular case, prior to halving 3, 13,900 happens to be that resistance. But of course, we've always seen a breakout past that resistance prior to the halving. So what I'd be looking for is, of course, that breakdown from the 200 daily EMA, the retest of this weekly high or low as a support and a rebound. And once we see that rally from there, I will be looking for a break of this yearly high or low, this old yearly high of 13,900. And once we get that, we will probably see a new yearly high, or at least a new high in the bull market, because of course the bull market started around here. The high is 13,900, but once we break past this old yearly high, we'll probably see a high of around 17,000. In terms of my investing strategy, this is where I can slightly decouple a portion of my portfolio into a trading portfolio. So of course, at these lows, upon breaking of the 200 daily EMA and the test of this weekly high or low, I could accumulate a little bit extra for a trade, for a trading portfolio, where I'd probably start to sell around that 17,000, 16,000 level. And here's why. So if we just cycle to all the previous halvings, once we see a break past this yearly high, we tend to see a new high, right? But then we see a very strong retrace still prior to the halving. So we have a new yearly high, a new high in the bull market, and then a pre-halving retrace, all before the halving. So there's a lot going on as we approach the halving, and the same thing here is happening. This is what I'm going to be looking for, that breakout past the old yearly high, and then this peak, this pre-halving peak. And that's essentially where I'm going to be shedding my trading portfolio. That's probably going to be the moment where I sell my trading portfolio, and maybe even some of my investing portfolio as well. We'll see. That's something I have to still decide on. But in any case, point number 4 to my investing strategy is later accumulating on these pre-halving retraces. And as you can see, these pre-halving retraces are great opportunities for investors such as myself. And the thing to bear in mind here is that every time we have a pre-halving retrace, we test this old yearly high as a new support. So you can see that this is going to be a new support, whereas before it was figuring as a new resistance. And of course, the same thing happens over here. We have a Bitcoin having this resistance right over here, but then we actually see a wick to test this old yearly high as a new support. So that's something I'd be looking for once we see a breakout past the old yearly high of 13,900, a peak around here, 28% away from there, and then that pre-halving retrace to potentially retest this level once again as a new support this time, rather than a resistance. And the cool thing about this 13,900 number is that it also happens to be a yearly resistance. Of course, the yearly resistance is around 14,334 on the yearly chart, but in any case, this is still very close to 13,900. This confluence isn't circumstantial. And it's interesting to see that if we consider these 4-year cycles for Bitcoin, then in this year, we're probably going to be seeing number 4 right over here perform the same sort of technical price action that we saw in number 4 over here. So essentially, we'll see a breach of that old yearly high of 13,900, and number 4, candle number 4, is going to try and close on the yearly time frame above this level of around 14,000. Very similarly, to this candle number 4 from the previous 4-year cycle. And this is something I talk about in so much more detail in my previous video from yesterday, so check it out in the top right hand corner. It's a fantastic video because it ties in perfectly with my next part of the strategy in terms of my investing towards Bitcoin, and that's the fact that we tend to see new all-time highs in the year following the halving. So here we're looking at Bitcoin halving 1, of course. Here we see that pre-halving retrace of around 50%, a great accumulation strategy for an investor such as myself in Bitcoin. And after that retrace, we see price go and appreciate towards the upside. But of course, we have to bear in mind that November 2012 is when the first halving happened. But the new all-time high for Bitcoin actually happened a few months after that. So in the new year of around April 2013. And the same thing can be said about Bitcoin halving number 2. Here's the 38% retrace, the pre-halving retracement period prior to the halving, prior to halving 2, and then we see price appreciation towards the upside to new exponential highs once again, and then we see a topping out in December 2017. So essentially around a year, more than a year past the halving 2 of July 2016. So part number 5 to my investing strategy for Bitcoin for 2020 is holding, because once Bitcoin takes off after the halving, we see these sort of gains, over 3,400% gains after halving 1 and 4,080% gains after halving 2. So most of Bitcoin's growth as a result of the halving occurs after the halving. So for me, I'm just going to be holding until that new all-time high, because if we cycle to this chart, once we get that candle 4 and that close above the old yearly high over here, then we'll see a candle like this repeat, an exponential candle move towards the upside into new all-time highs. So it would probably look like something like this or a bit lower. Of course, I talk about that in the other video, so check it out if you haven't yet. But in any case, it will just be holding. It will just be holding until that new all-time high, until 20,000 is breached, and then that's what I'm going to be thinking about, where price could potentially go and where we need to start profit taking and shedding a bit of our position as we go along as the bull market progresses. But in any case, there is also a small part 6 to my investing strategy, and that's also accumulating on dips, because after the halving, if we look at Bitcoin halving number 1 once again, then these dips also offer small financial opportunities before we see exponential highs. And here, Bitcoin halving number 2, we see more dips, more dipping price action. So accumulating on dips is also part of my investing strategy. Of course, we'd be buying at higher price levels, but we definitely have a new confirmation of that uptrend. So that is an optional thing, that's an optional part of my investing strategy, something that I could bear in mind, because these dips are definitely for buying. Because in a healthy growth cycle, in an exponential bull market, in an exponential Bitcoin bull market, following one of the most important fundamental events in Bitcoin's protocol, you have to bear in mind that any downside action in such a strong uptrend is a very good opportunity to just reaccumulate before that uptrend resumes. And that's just about it for today's video on my Bitcoin investing strategy for 2020. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please consider dropping a like, and of course feel free to subscribe for more videos like this in the future. I'm more than happy to continue producing this content on a daily basis as long as you find value in it. So drop a like, subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for watching today. I'm Rekt Capital, and I'll speak to you very soon.